Prisoners of war, the lost armies. The mobile type of warfare of World War II often made it impossible for outnumbered land forces to be extricated and left them no alternative to destruction but surrender. It was thus that millions of able-bodied soldiers, in addition to seriously wounded, were taken prisoner between 1939 and 1945. The rights of prisoners of war were fully safeguarded by the Geneva Convention of 1929, a copy of which was displayed in every POW camp, or should have been. The protecting power, a neutral government, appointed BJ a belligerent to look after its interests in enemy territory until the restoration of normal diplomatic relations, was entrusted with control of POW camps and authorized to send delegates to visit camps and investigate complaints. The International Committee of the Red Cross also had the right to visit camps, and these visits soon became established as regular practice. Article 79 of the Convention entitled the International Committee to propose to the belligerent powers the organization of a central information agency for the reception, recording, and forwarding of information and replies to inquiries about prisoners of war. The agency was established in September 1939, but not all nations were signatories to the Convention. Japan had signed but not ratified it, and was not, therefore, bound by its terms. The Japanese government declared, however, shortly before entering the war in December 1941, that it would apply the provision mutatis mutandis to all prisoners of war, and, subject to reciprocity, non-combatant internees of enemy countries. The Red Cross societies of the Allies and the International Committee were thus led to expect that they would be granted the same facilities to carry out their work as in other countries. But they were mistaken. The committee's office in Tokyo was regarded with suspicion by the Japanese, and the work of the delegates was tolerancé, TED rather than permitted. Their mail was censored, delayed, and withheld. They had to obtain permits to visit camps, and reasons were often found to cancel or delay visits. They were not notified of the existence of a great many camps, and never obtained a complete list of prisoners. Russia applied the terms of the Hague Regulations of 1907, which the Geneva Convention superseded, according to which each belligerent state set up an information bureau to answer inquiries. The transmission of a nominal role was not stipulated, nor any mention made of the central agency. The Soviet Union, in fact, shrouded its actions in mystery. Consequently, Germany received no information regarding troops captured by the Russians, and ceased to transmit lists of Russian prisoners, or to allow camp visits to them, although the state of Russian prisoners in Germany greatly concerned the International Committee. In Germany, the committee's delegates visited camps for prisoners of all countries, except Russia. The enormous variety of camp conditions and of individual experiences makes difficult any wide generalization regarding POW's conditions varied in different countries, and, inside these countries, in different camps at different periods of the war, quite often according to the personality of the camp commandant. The local supplies of food, water, and medicine, as well as local conditions of heat, cold, and dampness, all had influence. In general, it may be said that prisoner conditions in the Far East were more damaging to health than those in Europe. Accommodation for POWs was limited and of varying quality. Allied troops captured in North Africa often waited months in transit camps and in very poor conditions, spending days in crowded trucks and nights herded into wire pens. Paraf, many contracted dysentery and were weakened by a lengthy period on short rations. Louse infestation was common, together with a shortage of water. More permanent POW camps in Italy and Germany were sometimes purpose-built stone barracks, or may previously have been a school or a castle. The camp at Eichstätt, Oflag 7B, was previously a cavalry barracks, and that at Gavi, an old castle. Gavi was extremely damp and unpleasant in the winter. Here, officers slept 8 or 10 to a room 20 feet long by 12 feet wide, with one small window and one faint electric light. It was short of latrines and water, and there was no exercise space except the castle yard at restricted times. On the other hand, Oflag 7B had fine grounds with garden, sports field, and 2 tennis courts for the use of prisoners. There were also parole walks in the Bavarian countryside, and in winter an ice skating rink was prepared. Some of the worst conditions in Europe were at the Camp Oflag VIB at Dossel. In a desolate and exposed area, it comprised a number of old wooden huts with leaking roofs and walls. There were no proper paths, and the area became a slough of mud when it rained. The huts were rat-infested, and beds and bedding were dirty and flea-ridden. Between 16 and 52 officers were quartered in rooms measuring 21 feet by 12 feet. Latrines here discharged into 3 open cesspools, which, in bad weather, overflowed inside the camp. Most prisoners experienced something like this at some time in their captivity. Many camps in Europe were improved as time went on, and many of the improvements were due to the visits by neutrals. Conditions did not improve in the Far East. Prisoners of the Japanese were imprisoned in various camps around Changi when they surrendered in early 1942. For the first few months, life was not intolerable, but conditions got worse as time went on. 5 or 6 men were crammed in a one-man cell, rations were cut and drug supplies dwindled. The Japanese came to look on the prisoners only as a source of labour, and many of them were moved out of Changi to go to work in Borneo, where only a few survived the notorious death march, to go to Thailand to build the railway, or to go to Japan, to Arke in the mines. Conditions were really appalling at the jungle camps for the railway workers. The Japanese had a deadline to meet, and were not worried when their prisoners died in their hundreds from overwork, undernourishment, cholera, or malaria. To the Japanese, there were plenty more prisoners. The POWs lived in bamboo huts at these jungle camps, and monsoon rains added further to their discomfort. All except the officers were accustomed to being beaten up by Japanese guards, and men were sometimes beaten to death. It is now well known how much the ill treatment of POWs in the Far East owed to the Japanese tradition that a captive brought dishonour on himself and his family. In fact, the traditions of the Imperial Japanese Army established a principle that the military honour of a soldier forbade his surrender to the enemy. The military regulations promulgated by the Japanese Minister of War in January 1942 reaffirmed the idea and made it enforceable. The Japanese training manual said those becoming pensioners of war will suffer the death penalty. Combat instructions advised troops to commit suicide rather than be captured. When a Japanese soldier left his family to join a combatant unit, a farewell ceremony was held in accordance with funeral rites. And after his departure, he was regarded as dead by his family unless he should return as a conqueror. Since notification of his capture would disgrace his family, few Japanese desired it. In view of these considerations, the attitude of Japanese troops towards their captives was hardly likely to be other than one of contempt, since prisoners were little better than dead men. Their living conditions were of small importance. It was no wonder that the Japanese authorities took little interest in transmitting information concerning captives. A neglect of wounded prisoners and their murder of some of them were the logical consequences of their military code. The beatings into unconsciousness, the mass punishments in the presence of an arch-offender before his more frightful torture in private, the bayonet-ting to death, and the beheading of recaptured escapers, all become more explicable in terms of the severe discipline of the Japanese. The Nazi government was committed to being correct in its observance of the Geneva Convention, and did not physically mistreat prisoners as did the Japanese, although they did shackle some British POWs at Stalag 30B, at Stalag 1YC, and at Heihenfels. This was a High Command order, and was a reprisal for British ill-treatment of German prisoners at the time of the Dieppe raid, and also during the Commando raid on Sark. As time went by, however, conditions were relaxed for the shackled prisoners. It was also Nazi policy to use their prisoners to the utmost and make them as little of a drain on the national economy as possible. Officers and NCOs did not have to work, but as many troops as could be were pushed out into farm work, coal mining, factory work, and any unskilled tasks that would free Germans for a more active part in the war effort. Work camps were called Arbeitskommandos. The majority of them were in industrial areas, and sometimes in the centre of a town. Although long hours may have been expected, treatment of POWs was often quite good. Prisoners who remained inside POW camps soon organised their lives. In 1942, Changi Camp organised itself into an establishment of battalions, regiments, brigades and divisions, each with its own headquarters and formal staff. The digging of more boreholes was organised to try to stem the dysentery outbreak, and the cookhouses were adapted to meet the needs of such a vast influx of people. The Japanese gave food and money only to those who worked, so food was shared, and each payday, workers made a contribution to a welfare fund, which bought drugs and special foods for the sick. The majority of POWs in camps in Europe had long periods during which conditions were bearable, and when they made good use of their time. With amazing improvisation, for which captivity was the stimulus, many were able to lead a vigorous and intellectual life. By summer 1942, for example, prisoners had got life at Lambsdorff pretty well organised. Enough supplies of Red Cross food and private clothing and tobacco parcels arrived regularly. The medical supplies were adequate. Here, half a barrack was set aside as a church, the other half serving as the camp school. There were vegetable and flower gardens and facilities for football, cricket, and all-in wrestling. All these other activities did not prevent much attention being devoted to escaping. There were many attempts, both from permanent and work camps. Men tried to walk out of camps disguised in German uniforms, or tried to leave hidden in some form of transport. There was much tunnelling activity. Many camps had escape organisations, with escape officers. Here, all escape activity was coordinated, with the officers taking turns to warn of the approach of the German guards. These escape routes permitted many men to reach Allied territory. A series of mass breakouts in 1944 culminated in that from Stalag Luft III in March 1944, when 76 POWs escaped through tunnels. 3 reached England, a few got to Danzig, but the majority were recaptured. 50 of these were shot in the back by the Gestapo. Escape activity was different in the Far East. For white prisoners, there was the difficulty of concealment in a city of Asiatics. Also, at Japanese camps, successful breakouts were followed by reprisals on the rest of the inmates, and the knowledge of this did much to discourage attempts. Medical treatment for POWs in Europe was not a great problem. The Red Cross was usually able to supply necessary medicines, and Allied prisoners were treated in German civil or military hospitals, or in special hospitals for POWs. There was no such treatment for prisoners in Japanese hands. No drugs reached them in usable quantities until the end of 1944, and under the appalling conditions already described, the medical teams had to rely on their own resources and initiative. Wood saws were used to amputate limbs, razor blades served as scalpels, and old pieces of clothing were the only available material for bandages. The death camps. The Nazi concentration camp system was the most far-reaching and closely concerted act of terror organised and carried out after January 30th, 1933 by a state under the cover of legality. The terror itself was an expression of the huge breakdown of German society, of the interclass struggle, and of the historical impasse of the 1930s. This impasse was not specifically German. It was worldwide, and because it was worldwide, it made the German situation open-ended. That society's foundations were crumbling was evident from the world's increasingly rapid descent into war, and from the almost simultaneous appearance of 2 concentration camp systems. The Soviet and the Nazi, each fed and controlled by state terror. In this wide setting, the concentration camp takes on its full historical meaning. For the first time in modern history, there is a very real, as opposed to an imaginary, possibility of a halt in human evolution, of humanity slipping down into organised barbarism. The salient fact that the Nazi counter-revolution developed not before the seizure of power by the party, but after the legal installation of this power, and on the legal basis of the state, plays a very important part in the development of the concentration camp system, determining its administration, its function, and its regime. Its basic function was to carry to its conclusion the state's policy of political and social violence, and it was in the very accomplishment of this task, in the thoroughness with which it was carried out, that the concentration camp somehow emancipated itself from the state which created it, becoming a social force within itself. Then, by its own internal growth, profoundly altering the entire network of social relationships. The political prisoner was to be the typical concentration camp detainee, and by political prisoner must be meant all those who, by their ideas and convictions, represented a resistance, active or passive, suspected or real, against one or the other of the activities of the establishment. He could be a communist, a socialist, a liberal, or a democrat, a trades unionist, or a member of a university, a Christian, a pacifist, or merely a fanatic. They all, from the state's point of view, represented evil. Opposition was not considered as opposition, but as a crime, and disagreement as heresy. This idea of evil brought in the irrationality of unbridled passions, and once society began to break down, it became irrational in all its activities, but retained an inner logic which dominated the concentration camp world. The aim of the concentration camp was not just the death of the guilty, but a suibiuromailoai, slow death by degradation. From the Nazi point of view, that was one of the basic differences between the treatment of the political prisoner and the treatment of the Jew. The political prisoner was the subjective evil, conscious of himself. The Jew was the objective evil, like a poisonous plant. The plant had to be plucked out, the Jew destroyed. The problem of the destruction of the Jew was a mass problem which was to pose acute logistical questions of means and time. The humiliations the Jews were made to suffer were in the order of personal satisfaction for the oppressors. At the level of general directives, it was a question only of humiliation. The political prisoner, on the other hand, had to be punished. The supreme punishment was to be the gradual destruction of his humanity. Death was the end, certainly, but death must be expected and prepared for in suffering. This function of the camp was so basic that it was to remain even when the necessities of war and the personal interests of the SS made concentration camp prisoners into a labour force, and the camps became part of the production process. Suffering was always to have priority over production. The death of the political prisoner demanded time, therefore, a time filled with suffering, and a time for the camps to develop into societies. The war was to bring most of Europe into this universe. At 0600 hours on March 15th, 1939, German tanks rolled into Bohemia. That same evening, Hitler made a thunderous entry into Prague. Czechoslovakia has ceased to exist. Himmler appointed Dr. Hans Frank Chief of Police of the Protectorate. On September 1st, 1939, German tanks drove into the heart of Poland. On October 7th, Hitler appointed Reichsführer Heinrich Himmler head of a new organisation, the Reich Commissariat for the Strengthening of the German Nation, RKFDV. Poles and Jews were to be deported from the annexed Polish provinces and replaced by Germans. On October 9th, Himmler decreed that 550,000 out of the 650,000 Jews from these provinces were to be sent east of the Vistula. In 1 year, in fact, resigned 200,000 Poles and 300,000 Jews were to disappear to the east. The hour for mighty tasks had struck. For the first time, the formidable Nazi terror apparatus had a real job to do. Mass extermination. On August 22nd, on the eve of the Polish operation, Hitler is reported to have said, in a somewhat oracular tone, to his generals assembled at Obersalzberg, that certain things were to happen which would not be to their liking, and that they were warned not to meddle. On October 18th, General Haider noted in his diary a conversation Hitler had had that day with the Quartermaster General, Eduard Wagner, who reported it to him. The Polish intelligentsia must be prevented from rising to become a ruling class. Life must be preserved at a low level only. Cheap slaves. Frank was appointed Governor-General of Poland with the first task of eliminating the Polish intellectuals, which his directives called an extraordinary action of pacification. It would be of no avail to seek an explanation of this policy in Hitler's psychological makeup or in the dementia characteristic of the SS. The orders carried out were the exact replicas of Stalin's in the Baltic states and against various other national minorities. It was therefore a general phenomenon characteristic of this period, the origins of which are to be sought in the breakdown of world society, in the spread of state-organised terror in the two countries concerned, and in the deep disturbances caused in every field of activity by the growth of the concentration camp system. Terror created the camps which, as they developed, increased the impact of the acts of terror, which in turn gave further impetus to the camp system. In the Nazi case, the phenomenon is clearly seen in its spatial development and its social effects. Each stage brought a spectacular increase in SS bureaucracy and a growth of its powers, so that its importance to the state increased continually, and caused typical distortions of the social framework at all levels. The suppression of the intelligentsia was no act of folly. It showed an exact understanding of modern society and its level of development. It is undeniable that the physical annihilation of the whole of the intellectual class stops social growth immediately, and then leads to its rapid regression. That such a strategy can have been put into practice reveals in the most striking way the depth of barbarism of which Hitler and Stalin were the active agents. What their henchmen did not understand was that inevitably these acts were to produce a similar regression amongst themselves. The logic of terror is stronger than those who unleash it. The annihilation in Poland was to spread to Russia. The destruction of the Jews was thus only one particular case in an overall policy. Yet it is a truly extraordinary case which seems to be an exclusive product of Nazism. Nothing shows more clearly the extent to which certain circles were haunted by the Jewish question than this letter from General von Fritsch to his friend the Baroness Margot von Schutzbar in December 1938. The general hated Himmler and the SS. By the meanest of provocations, they nearly cost him his honour. They broke his career, yet he could write. Shortly after the war, I became convinced that we would have to win 3 victories if we were to recover our power. 1 against the working classes. Hitler has won this one. 2 against the Catholic Church, or rather against the Ultramontanes. 3 against the Jews. We're in the middle of the last 2, and that against the Jew is the more difficult. It was difficult because of the large numbers of Jews involved when the SS had to tackle it on a European scale and wipe them out. At the Nuremberg trials, a directive addressed to Heydrich by Göring was produced. It was dated July 31st, 1941, and expressly said, "This is to give you full powers to make preparations concerning a total solution of the Jewish question in the European territories under German control." Heydrich was to say before 15 high-ranking civil servants on June 20th, 1942, the final solution of the Jewish problem in Europe affects approximately 11 million Jews. He then explained how they were to be concentrated in the East and employed on the hardest work. The rest, he went on, those who survive, and they will doubtless be the toughest, will have to be treated, for in them we shall have, by a process of natural selection, the germ of a new Jewish expansion. On February 23rd, 1940, SS Brigadeführer Richard Glicks, head of the concentration camp inspectorate, wrote to Himmler to say that he had found a suitable site near Auschwitz, a little town of some 12,000 inhabitants, lost in the marshes, with some old barrack buildings formerly belonging to the Austrian cavalry. On June 14th, Auschwitz got its first Polish political detainees who were to be treated harshly. At the same time, G. Farben decided to establish at Auschwitz a synthetic petrol and rubber plant. In the spring of 1940, the SS arrived with, at their head, two of the greatest criminals in the Nazi concentration camp world, Josef Kramer and Rudolf Franz Höss. The latter stated with some satisfaction at Nuremberg that he had presided over the extermination of 2,500,000 people at Auschwitz, not including, he added, another 500,000 who had had the right to starve to death. Thus the Auschwitz zone, the most extensive and the most sinister, came into being. Then there appeared the mass extermination camps, the Vernichtungslager. The organisation of the vast complex of Auschwitz was exactly like that of all other concentration camp towns, surrounded by their satellites. The gas chambers introduced one more degree of terror: insuperable organisational problems. In their immediate, least refined, but most military objective, general terror methods aimed at annihilation raise problems of mass and speed which are difficult to solve. In 1939, Himmler and Heydrich decided in principle on the setting up of special action groups, or Einsatzgruppen, with 4 units labelled A, B, C and D. They were to follow the troops advancing into Poland and later into Russia. Their objective would be the elimination of political commissars and Jews. They solved 2 minor problems: keeping the army out of it and giving the SS an autonomous military body, adapted to its purpose and therefore efficient. One of the leaders, Otto Ohlendorf, formerly head of Amt III of the Central Office of Reich Security, Reichssicherheitshauptamt or RSHA, then from June 1941 to June 1942, of Einsatzgruppe D, attached to the Second Army in the South Ukraine, declared at Nuremberg that his men had executed 90,000 men, women and children. In a report seized later by the Allies, Gruppe A, operating in Belorussia and the Baltic states, estimated that it killed 229,052 Jews up to January 31st, 1942. According to Eichmann, the Einsatzgruppen working in the east exterminated 2 million people, most of them Jews. Efficient though the special groups were in certain respects, their work could not be secret, and, given the size of their task, was low in productivity. In the spring of 1942, Himmler authorized the introduction of gas vans, especially for the extermination of women and children. Ohlendorf explained how they worked. "You could not guess their purpose from their outside appearance," he said. "They were like closed lorries and were built so that when the engine started, the exhaust fumes filled the inside, causing death in 10 to 15 minutes. These were a step forward in the matter of secrecy, but they did not add much to the speed of the operation. There were not enough of them. Their use also brought dangerous psychological consequences on those who worked them. Even for the specialized troops, it took some nerve to bring out all the bodies. The worst was that they only killed 15 to 25 at a time. The real progress came with the installation of gas chambers in Auschwitz. These meant secrecy, speed, and no psychological consequences. The loneliness of the site ensured total secrecy. The time was cut to between 3 and 15 minutes. Quantity was satisfactory. In the last period, a gas chamber at Birkenau could kill 6,000 people a day. The psychological consequences were eliminated as the bodies were handled by a Sonderkommando, detainees who would themselves be exterminated a few months later. When the system was fully operative, however, there were bottlenecks in the transfer of the bodies from the chambers to the cremation ovens. In spite of several suggestions, no workable solution was found. The setting up of this procedure was clearly explained by Rudolf Höss in his evidence. "In June 1941, he said, I received the order to organize the extermination at Auschwitz. I went to Treblinka to see how it operated there. The commandant at Treblinka told me that he had got rid of 80,000 detainees in 6 months. He used carbon monoxide, but his methods did not seem very efficient to me. So when I set up the extermination block at Auschwitz, I chose Zyklon B, crystallized prussic acid, which we dropped into the death cells through a little hole. It took from 3 to 15 minutes, according to atmospheric conditions, for the gas to have effect. We also improved on Treblinka by building gas chambers holding 2,000, whereas theirs only held 200. A Nuremberg witness spoke of the duties of the Sonderkommando. The first job was to get rid of the blood and the excrement before separating the interlocked bodies, which we did with hooks and nooses, before we began the horrible search for gold and the removal of hair and teeth, which the Germans considered strategic raw materials. Then the bodies were sent up by lifts or in wagons on rails to the ovens, after which the remains were crushed to a fine powder. The gas chamber method at Auschwitz gave rise to a further refinement, selection. The detainees were selected on first arriving, then again more or less periodically within the camp, and this caused an extraordinary increase in terror. On July 22, 1941, Keitel signed 2 directives. In view of the considerable extent of the area of occupation in Soviet territory, the first one ran, "The security of the German armed forces can only be assured if all resistance on the part of the civilian population is punished, not by the legal prosecution of the guilty, but by measures of terror, which are the only ones which can efficiently strangle all inclination to rebel." In the second directive, Keitel laid on Himmler the special duty of drawing up plans for the administration of Russia. To achieve this, Hitler specified that he had delegated to Himmler the right to act on his own responsibility and with absolute power. Keitel then made clear the Führer's intentions by decreeing that the occupied zones will be out of bounds during the time Himmler is carrying out his operations. No one was to be admitted, not even the highest-ranking party officials. The concentration camp system was now in full swing. It was the basis of the social and political dominance of the SS. The power of the SS was practically at its height. In the very middle of the war, it was still stronger than the army. It dominated the party. It had a stranglehold on the administration. It was going to reach the peak of its power by bringing the concentration camps into the production lines. Change of emphasis. 1942 was the great turning point, the year in which the concentration camp was integrated in the production process. This was brought about by 4 fundamental documents. An ordinance of March 1942 transferred the administration of the camps, Konzentrationslager or KZ, from the Central Office of Reich Security, RSHA, to the Economic and Administrative Services of the SS, the SS Wirtschaftsverwaltungshauptamt, WVHA, directed by SS Obergruppenführer and General des Waffen SS Oswald Pohl. In an ordinance dated March 3rd and enabling documents of April 30th, Pohl set up the concentration camp work charter. The aims state, "The war has clearly changed the structure of the KZ and our task as far as detention is concerned. The imprisonment of detainees for sole reasons of security, correction, or prevention is not the first object. The importance has now shifted to the field of the economy. This has caused certain measures to be taken, which will allow the KZ to progress from their former purely political role to organisations adapted to economic tasks. The Charter had as its prime objective to insert in the new course of events the essential and permanent function of the concentration camps as conceiving work as a means of punishment and extermination. The constraints were therefore increased, and this is the clearest difference between a concentration camp worker and a slave. Articles 4, 5 and 6 made decisive provisions and revealed without any doubt the real spirit behind the undertaking. Article 4. The camp commandant alone is responsible for the use to which the workers are put. This can be exhausting, Ehrschopfand, in the literal sense so as to achieve the highest productivity. Article 5. Length of work to be limitless, to be laid down by the commandant alone. Article 6. Anything which can shorten work, meal times, roll calls, etc., to be reduced to the strict minimum. Movements and midday breaks for rest alone are forbidden. In his comments, Pohl added that the detainees were to be fed, accommodated, and treated in a way such as to obtain the maximum out of them with the minimum cost. The articles are of salient interest. They are the legal basis of the SS ownership of the concentration camp labour force. They define the system of extermination by work. The SS commandant alone is responsible for the use to which the workers are put. Therefore, the worker did not belong to the state, that is to the Minister of Labour, or of Armaments, or of War Production, and he could not be handed over by the state to private enterprise. So that the state could use him, so that a private firm could employ him, an agreement had to be reached with, and a fee paid to the SS, which, with its autonomous bureaucracy, was the sole owner of the concentration camp worker. This gave it an economic monopoly. Thus, the SS became rooted in the production process. The SS commandant alone is responsible for the system of work. The SS was thus in law the owner not only of the workforce, but also of the worker's whole person, without restriction of any kind. This provision gave the SS the authority and the means to carry out its job of extermination. Minister of Justice Tirac, describing a conversation he had just had with Goebbels, explained the word Erschöpfend. To define the new regime, he used the expression extermination through work, Vernichtung durch Arbeit. Hues reported to the Nuremberg trial. Obergruppenführer Pohl told a meeting of camp leaders that every detainee must be used up to the last ounce of his strength for the armament industry. It was Pohl also who defined for the Nuremberg jury the final solution of the Jewish question as the extermination of Jewry. On September 18th, an agreement was reached between Himmler and Tirac on the transfer of Jews, social dropouts, Hungarian gypsies, Russians, Ukrainians, etc., from prisons to concentration camps with a view to their extermination through work. These texts were preceded and prepared by a series of decisions. The decision in principle to turn the detainees into a labour force was taken on June 23, 1939, by the Council for the Defence of the Reich. Dr. Funk, economics minister, got the job of deciding the work to be given to the prisoners of war and the concentration camp detainees. Himmler intervened and said, concentration camps will be drawn on more extensively in wartime. Yet it was not until September 29, 1941 that a first application was made, and this was only preparatory. A directive from the inspector of camps recommending the setting up in each camp of an Arbeitseinsatz service, i.e. to administer labour. A first indication of the turning point was on November 15th, when, correcting an order dated November 9th by the head of the Gestapo, Heinrich Müller, Himmler made it known that Red Army political commissars sent to the Käse for execution could be employed in quarries, work considered, and rightly so, as particularly hard. These basic texts were followed by a set of executive measures, the first and most widely applicable being the Ordinance of December 14, 1942, under which the numbers interned in the camps were to be increased by 35,000 able-bodied detainees. The ordinance was sent to all police services on December 17th. On March 23rd, Kaltenbrunner, who took over from Heydrich as head of the RSHA, ordered this plan to be carried out. Turning point. It is clear from Himmler's explanations to the SS at Poznan in 1943 that a turning point was reached with the extermination through work plan, and that those concerned knew it very well. Recalling 1941, and nothing shows more clearly, that until then the 1939 decision of principle had not yet been put into effect. He said, "We didn't look on this mass of humanity then in the same light as we do now. A brutish mass, a labour force. We deplore, not as a generation, but as a potential workforce, the loss of prisoners by the million from exhaustion and starvation." Let no one be deceived. Himmler and the SS had not been converted to economics. The usual plundering of Jews' property was a byproduct, not a cause, of their deportation. Göring was able to claim, I received a letter written by Bormann on orders from the Führer requiring a coordinated approach to the Jewish question. As the problem was primarily an economic one, it had to be tackled from the economic point of view. He was preaching to the wind. Selection was to go on as in the past. No examination was made of a detainee's real qualifications or state of health. Selection on arrival and inside the camps was still an act of terror. A potentially very powerful labour force continued to be sacrificed to the vengeance of the SS. The supreme criterion was still the disintegration of human beings, their abasement, and their slow death, however. Whatever the importance of this turning point, it did not affect the essential function of the camps. It merely gave them a different emphasis. The crucial discovery was that through a concentration camp, labour force, two key objectives were reached. Production was maintained, and punishment meted out. The second major discovery was that the labour force increased the power of the SS so much that it transformed it. However, right to the very end, the norms of destruction were more important than those of productivity. Those who survived the camps know this well. This comes out of the statutory instruments so clearly that these can show the difference in law between slave labour and concentration camp labour. The slave or serf owner took elementary precautions in his own interest, and in the interest of production, to keep the labour force alive. The concentration camp saw to it that everything was done to exterminate the labour force by wearing it out. If economic sense and logic were to prevail, this would clearly be aberrant. This constant will to destroy had one far-reaching consequence: the need for a rapid renewal of the workforce. All legal decisions became null and void in the face of this need. The slightest accusation, well-founded or not, the most commonplace of court sentences, could open the gates of the camps when there were numbers to make up. People would be hounded down by terror more than ever. Yet these swoops by the secret police had their fixed basic rules. Transport difficulties were so appalling that the losses in transit were enormous. The pressure of events was relentless. The cause of the turning point lay completely in the unexpected prolongation of the war, in the great extent of the front, in the continuation, in spite of everything, of blitzkrieg strategy, and in the effects of all this on manpower and industry. It was in the winter of 1941-42 that Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel raised the whole vital question of manpower. The army needed an annual reserve of 2 to 2.5 million men. Normal recruitment, plus the return of the wounded and some barrel scraping, could produce only 1 million. This left 1.5 million to be found elsewhere. Elsewhere could only mean on the production lines. Factories had therefore to work at full capacity, and beyond it to meet the ever-increasing needs and to make up for the now dangerous contribution to the Allied effort from the United States. So, the whole of Europe had to be mobilised, and this could only be done by intensifying constraints and terror. The General Staff of the Forced Labour Administration consisted of Keitel, Speer, Sauckel, and Himmler. Keitel was responsible for the recruitment of Army, Navy, and Air Force reserves. Albert Speer ran the top organisation from February 15, 1942, and was then put in charge of what, on September 2, 1943, became the Ministry of Armament and War Production. Fritz Sauckel, nominated General Plenipotentiary for the allocation of labour, had the job of putting into effect the forced labour programme. Finally, Himmler was the number one contractor. This very considerable undertaking brought a clash between two branches of state service under Keitel and Speer on the one hand and Himmler on the other. Keitel represented military bureaucracy and Speer the joint interests of the state and powerful private enterprise, and his was a key ministry as it brought monopolies into the state system. High-ranking management jobs were given to industrialists who at the same time remained in charge of their firms. Sauckel was merely an executive. Speer indicated to him what was wanted. Himmler provided the means. Sauckel coordinated. In January 1944, when Hitler ordered Sauckel to recruit 4 million workers, Himmler replied that to get them, he would increase the number of concentration camp detainees and make them all work harder. The matter which brought Keitel and Speer up against Himmler was the key question of who owned the forced labour gangs, and in particular the concentration camp labourers. Keitel and Speer said the state, which had sovereign rights over them. Himmler replied the SS, and to employ them, there had to be a contract with his economic service, or more precisely, with his Amtsgruppe D, which ran the camps, or with the KZ commandants who, under the Pole Ordinance, had sole control of the use of the camp labour force. Fundamentally, what was at stake was the ownership of the slave and concentration camp labour, and the position of all hostile elements in production and society. At Nuremberg, Keitel revealed Himmler's empire building, his constant efforts to bring under his control prisoners of war, and then foreign and requisitioned workers. In September 1942, Hitler was called upon to settle the differences between the two totally opposed sides. Speer proposed that private enterprise should take over the camp detainees. His main argument was that this was the only way to get high productivity. Himmler retorted that industries should be set up inside the camps, as only the SS were legally qualified to deal jointly with the needs of production and repression. Speer objected that this could not be done because of the shortage of machine tools. Himmler agreed to a compromise: some industries to be set up in the camps, and some camps to be organised around existing industries. Factories would be built in regions where there were large concentration camp complexes. The ownership of the concentration camp labour force was recognised as belonging in law, and in fact to the SS private management and monopolies were required to pay to the SS a fee for each prisoner employed for the whole time he worked for them. Moreover, Speer had to agree to turn over to the SS 5% of all the arms made by the detainees. A conflict of principles was to become a conflict of execution. Himmler got his way then, because he was indispensable. To get the workers they needed, Keitel, Speer, and Sökel had to use the SS and its terror methods. They may have disliked it, but they could not do without it. The logic of the system worked for the SS. Behind all this, there were totally opposed ideas. For Speer, the decisive criterion was productivity. For the party and the SS, it was terror, as a social function. Speer won the concession, against the party, that Jews could work in arms factories. On Hitler's order, they were to be excluded in 1943, and in spite of this order, 100,000 Hungarian Jews were to work in underground factories in 1943. This gives Göring's letter quoted above its true meaning. The SS had made its final change and become an economic power. The importance of this was not that it had achieved great wealth, collectively by this change, but that it obtained the final means for its independence and established its stranglehold on the state. The only byproduct of extermination, which brought in huge fortunes, the gold from the Jewish corpses at Auschwitz, and the valuables taken from deportees, were deposited in the Reichsbank, where, by an agreement between Dr. Walter Funk and Himmler, they were credited to the SS in an account entered under the name of Max Heiliger. The deposits came so quickly and in such large quantities that to clear the vaults the bankers went to pawnbrokers and turned them into cash.